Ladies and gentlemen, there are journeys not of geography but of the soul, and among them few are as harrowing, or as transformative, as the path of the empath who has walked through the valley of narcissistic abuse. This is no ordinary trial. It is not merely emotional hardship. It is a psychic crucible, an alchemical fire that burns away all illusion. To be bound to the narcissist is to be drawn into a theater of shadows, where love is counterfeit and truth is distorted. The empath, often unaware of their own inner light, becomes ensnared in a dynamic that reflects not love, but projection, possession, and psychic vampirism. The first transformation that occurs in the final stage of the empath after narcissistic abuse is the death of the false self. This death is not one of violence or despair, but rather a slow, often painful unraveling, a quiet undoing of an identity that was never truly theirs to begin with. It is not simply the ending of a role, it is the collapse of an entire inner architecture, built brick by brick over time in the desperate hope of love, acceptance, and survival. The empath, in the early stages of the relationship, often becomes what the narcissist requires. They become the caretaker, the peacekeeper, the healer, the endlessly understanding companion. They offer softness in exchange for cruelty, silence in the face of chaos, and sacrifice under the illusion that such surrender is love. But this role, while noble on the surface, is built on self-abandonment. It is a mask worn so tightly that eventually the empath forgets it is a mask at all. What begins to crack, this false self, is not just the abuse itself, but the recognition that no amount of love given will ever be enough for someone who feeds on emptiness. The empath begins to see the cycle, not just live within it. They see how they are mirrored only when they are useful, how their emotions are twisted, their perceptions questioned, their worth made conditional. They begin to ask, "Who am I?" when I am not needed by someone broken? Who am I when I stop apologizing for my own existence? And in those questions, a deeper truth stirs. The death of the false self begins with the terrifying realization that their identity has been hijacked by trauma. What they believed was compassion was often compulsion. What they named loyalty was sometimes fear. What they thought was unconditional love was in part a profound disconnection from their own needs. This moment is not clean or beautiful. It is brutal. It often comes in the aftermath of discard, betrayal, or a series of soul-level betrayals. The empath may feel empty, unanchored, as if they no longer know how to be in the world without someone to save. But within that emptiness is sacred space. The mask falls away, and for the first time they see the contours of their real self, wounded, yes, but real. This self does not exist to serve others at the cost of its own sanity. It does not shift to avoid rejection. It begins to understand that worth is not transactional, and love is not earned through self. Erasure. This death of the false self also dismantles illusions about love itself. The empath begins to separate love from sacrifice, begins to see that love does not demand the shrinking of one soul for the comfort of another. They stop mistaking enmeshment for connection, stop chasing closure from those incapable of honesty. This stage is marked by solitude, but not loneliness. It is a sacred withdrawal, a turning inward. And in that quiet they grieve, not just the narcissist, but the parts of themselves that believed suffering was noble, that believed enduring was the same as being loved. With each layer that falls away, there is pain, but also clarity. They begin to differentiate between instinct and trauma response. They begin to hear their own voice again, faint at first, like an echo down a long hallway, but it grows, and it tells them truths they were once afraid to speak. That they deserve peace, that they are allowed to want without guilt, that their needs are not burdens but signals from the soul, and slowly the need to prove their worth fades. The compulsion to please dissolves. In its place a quiet strength takes root, not the strength to endure others' darkness, but the strength to protect their own light. They no longer beg to be seen, because they have learned to see themselves. The second transformation, in the final stage of the empath's journey, emerges through the reclamation of the shadow, a process as confronting as it is liberating. After narcissistic abuse, the empath often wakes up in a psychic wasteland where everything once believed about goodness, giving, and love feels stained with betrayal. Yet within that devastation lies the unexamined truth, the recognition that healing cannot come by placing all darkness outside the self. For the empath to evolve, they must stop seeing themselves only as victim and begin the courageous work of facing what within them allowed the pattern to persist. This does not mean blaming the self for abuse, but rather understanding the silent contracts made deep within the unconscious, contracts signed not with words but with childhood wounds, unmet needs, and unhealed fragments of identity that crave completion through others. The empath's shadow is not malevolent, it is not the enemy. It is the disowned parts of the self that learned early on that love must be earned, that safety comes through compliance, that attention requires performance. These patterns hide behind kindness, behind empathy, behind spiritual ideals that exalt selflessness, but often mask self-neglect. When the empath begins to reclaim the shadow, they confront the uncomfortable realization that part of their giving was transactional, not in a manipulative sense, but in a deeply unconscious attempt to secure love, approval, or even survival. They begin to see that being nice was sometimes a strategy, not an expression of true feeling. That forgiveness was sometimes offered too soon, not out of compassion, but from a fear of being left alone. This stage strips away moral superiority. The empath stops telling themselves stories of being the perpetual light in a world of darkness. They begin to ask deeper questions. Why did I need to be needed? What part of me found purpose in pain? Why did I stay silent when my soul was screaming? And in these questions, they stop identifying only with the role of healer and begin to see the fuller spectrum of their humanity. They see the pride that came with being the strong one, the identity built on being indispensable, the subtle sense of control that comes from always being the one who understands. They no longer reject their anger or jealousy or resentment. They bring these emotions into the light, not to indulge them, but to integrate them. Reclaiming the shadow also means taking back the projections once cast onto the narcissist. The empath often sees the narcissist as powerful, in control, emotionally detached, able to command attention and set boundaries, albeit in toxic ways. But underneath the projection is a hidden envy, a desire to possess some of those traits in a healthy form. By acknowledging this, the empath begins to reabsorb what they have given away. They realize they can be powerful without being manipulative, detached without being cold, assertive without being cruel. They stop fearing their own potential for strength, recognizing that it does not corrupt them but completes them. The shadow is not a place to be feared. It is where the empath's wholeness waits. This stage is messy. It is not linear. It demands truth, telling that may shake the foundations of identity. The empath may find themselves revisiting old memories through new eyes, seeing how often they ignored their intuition, how frequently they made excuses for the inexcusable. But this is not about shame. It is about seeing clearly, and in that clarity, the inner split begins to heal. They are no longer the good one in a binary of good versus evil. They are human, complex, capable of light and dark, and therein lies their strength. The empath who integrates the shadow becomes less reactive, less easily manipulated. They no longer confuse intensity with connection or chaos with passion. They begin to choose relationships that reflect their integrated self, not their wounded fragments. And in doing so, they step out of the cycle, not by escaping the narcissist, but by becoming someone who no longer resonates with that frequency at all. In the third stage of the empath's transformation after narcissistic abuse, there arises a profound shift known as emotional sovereignty, a state in which the empath begins to reclaim full ownership of their inner emotional world, without allowing it to be dictated, drained, or distorted by others. Before this point, the empath often lived in a state of emotional fusion, where their own feelings were indistinguishable from those of the narcissist. They absorbed moods like sponges, altered their emotional tone to soothe chaos, and became hyper, attuned to every shift in energy around them. In this state, their nervous system was not their own. It was calibrated to someone else's instability. Peace felt unfamiliar, even threatening, because they had been conditioned to find purpose in perpetual emotional labor. Emotional sovereignty begins when the empath realizes that not every emotion they feel is theirs to carry. They start to observe rather than absorb, to witness rather than personalize. It is a process of learning that feeling someone else's pain does not obligate them to fix it, and that empathy without boundaries is not a virtue. It is a form of self-betrayal. This awakening often begins with exhaustion, with the body and mind reaching a breaking point, no longer able to serve as a container for another person's unresolved chaos. The empath may experience a sudden intolerance for emotional manipulation, an inner resistance rising that they do not fully understand at first. What is happening is that the soul is reclaiming its space. The empath starts to separate their emotions from the projections of others. They begin to notice when guilt has been weaponized, when love is offered as a reward for compliance, and when vulnerability is used not for intimacy but for control. Emotional sovereignty means identifying these patterns not with anger, but with clarity. The empath stops playing the game of emotional guesswork. They stop walking on eggshells. They stop asking themselves what they did wrong every time someone else is upset. Instead, they start to ask, what do I feel? What do I need? And in this simple shift, they take back what was always theirs: the right to exist as a separate, sovereign being. This sovereignty also redefines what compassion means. It is no longer a compulsion to rescue, to soften every blow, to hold space for people who refuse to hold space for themselves. The empath realizes that compassion does not require self-sacrifice. In fact, true compassion includes the self. It means saying no without guilt. It means walking away without explanation. It means letting others feel the consequences of their own choices without rushing in to shield them from discomfort. The empath learns to tolerate the discomfort of not being understood, not being liked, not being the hero. They learn that someone else's disappointment is not proof of their wrongdoing. With emotional sovereignty comes a quieter, more grounded presence. The empath is no longer emotionally porous, no longer available for emotional hijacking. They begin to speak more slowly, listen more deeply, and feel more authentically. Their nervous system recalibrates. They no longer live in a state of emotional emergency. Their relationships shift. Some people fall away, not because the empath has changed for the worse, but because they have stopped enabling dysfunction. The ones who remain are those who respect boundaries, who offer mutuality, who bring peace rather than turmoil. This stage is not about becoming closed off or indifferent. It is about becoming rooted. It is the difference between a tree whipped by every gust of wind and a tree that bends only when it chooses to, whose roots go deep and whose branches reach upward not in desperation, but in wholeness. The empath no longer allows others to define their reality or dictate their emotional state. They begin to choose where their energy goes, what dynamics they engage in, and how they respond to emotional invitations. And in this choosing, they reclaim the authority over their inner world that was always meant to be theirs in the fourth stage of the empath's emergence from narcissistic abuse. There comes a profound internal metamorphosis that transcends personal healing and begins to awaken something archetypal. This is the point where the empath, having shed layers of illusion, reclaimed their shadow, and established emotional sovereignty, no longer views their experience solely through the lens of personal pain or individual injustice. Instead, they begin to perceive their journey as part of a deeper, universal pattern, a mythic cycle of descent, death, and rebirth that echoes through the collective unconscious. What once felt like chaos now reveals itself as initiation, and the empath starts to understand their suffering not as meaningless tragedy, but as symbolic transformation. This awareness is not intellectual. It is felt in the bones, in the psyche, in the silent moments when something within begins to stir and speak with ancient, wordless wisdom. The empath moves beyond the language of trauma. They stop defining themselves by the wound. There is less interest in identifying as a victim, less attachment to telling and retelling the story of betrayal, not because the pain didn't matter, but because it no longer defines who they are becoming. They begin to notice archetypes emerging through their own psychology: the wounded healer, the alchemist, the magician, the sovereign self. These symbols do not belong to any religion or dogma, they belong to the human soul. And the empath begins to understand that their personal experience with the narcissist was not random, but part of a much larger pattern, a necessary descent into shadow meant to awaken latent capacities within them. These capacities are not learned through theory, but through surviving and transmuting the unthinkable. This stage is marked by a deepening relationship with intuition and inner knowing. The empath no longer seeks constant validation from others to trust their perceptions. They no longer outsource their truth. Instead, they learn to listen inward, to consult the quiet voice that had been drowned out for so long by the noise of narcissistic distortion. Dreams become more vivid. Symbols appear in waking life with uncanny synchronicity. Old fears dissolve as if they were never truly real, and new inner landscapes begin to unfold, one shaped not by survival but by purpose. The empath realizes that they were never broken, they were dismembered from their essence, and now, piece by piece, that essence is returning. The archetypal awakening also reframes the narcissist, not as a singular villain, but as a representation of a larger force of unconsciousness. The empath no longer obsesses over their abuser's psychology, no longer searches for closure in the unreachable. They understand now that the narcissist was an archetypal teacher, albeit a brutal one, forcing them to confront their own blindness, their own disempowerment, their own undeveloped edges. This is not an excuse for the abuse, nor is it a justification. It is simply the recognition that meaning can be extracted even from darkness, that what was meant for destruction can become a doorway to awakening. In this realization, bitterness begins to evaporate. The empath no longer seeks revenge, no longer needs justice to be made visible, because they now carry an inner sense of balance that no external event can disturb. As this stage deepens, the empath begins to feel called towards something greater than personal healing. They may be drawn to creative work, spiritual exploration, or forms of service that help others navigate their own initiations. But this calling no longer comes from a wounded desire to rescue or fix. It arises from alignment, from integrity, from the overflow of a self that no longer leaks energy but generates it. They become not a savior, but a mirror, not a martyr, but a guide. The empath becomes less interested in being understood and more interested in being authentic. They realize that healing is not the end of the journey, it is the preparation for embodiment. They do not preach, they do not convert, they embody, they radiate. They become an archetype in motion, not a symbol of perfection, but of integration, and through this quiet embodiment, they begin to walk through the world with a new kind of presence, one that says, "I have been into the underworld and returned not empty, but full of something the world does not always recognize but desperately needs." In the fifth stage of the empath's transformation, a strange and unexpected state begins to emerge, one that seems almost impossible to imagine during the early stages of awakening. It is not rage, not sorrow, not even forgiveness. It is something quieter, something more elemental. It is sacred indifference. This is not numbness or dissociation, nor is it a cold detachment born from cynicism. It is a calm-rooted, unshakable neutrality that arises when the empath has fully exited the psychological and emotional matrix of the narcissist. In this space, the need to understand, to be understood, to be validated, or to be vindicated, dissolves entirely. The narcissist becomes irrelevant, not hated, not feared, not obsessed over, but simply removed from the psychic landscape altogether. Like a storm that has passed, there is no more desire to chase the rain or explain the thunder. This sacred indifference is hard, won. It cannot be rushed. It only comes when the inner work has been done so thoroughly that there is nothing left to react to. The empath no longer imagines conversations that will never happen. They no longer wait for apologies that will never come. They no longer revisit the past looking for meaning or try to decode manipulation in search of closure. That chapter no longer holds emotional charge. It becomes something like a distant memory, factual but no longer burning. The emotional strings that once pulled at their heart have been cut, not through force, but through the deep, organic process of detachment that comes when truth is integrated at the cellular level in this stage. The empath no longer needs to prove who the narcissist was. They stop warning others. They stop pleading for people to see what they now see. There is no longer a compulsion to correct the narrative or expose the deception. The desire to convince others fades because the need to convince oneself has vanished. They know what happened. They know who they are. That knowledge is no longer shaky or fragile. It is embodied. It lives in their bones, in their breath, in their silence. And from this place, the narcissist becomes simply another figure in the past, like a ghost who has lost its power because the house it once haunted is no longer inhabited. Sacred indifference is not a rejection of emotion. It is the evolution of it. The empath still feels deeply, still loves fiercely, still cares with authenticity, but not indiscriminately. Their empathy has become refined, sharpened by wisdom. It is no longer extended to those who weaponize it. It is no longer wasted on emotional black holes. The empath's energy becomes sacred, no longer up for auction. They give when it is right to give. They walk away when it is time to walk away. There is no drama in their boundaries, only clarity. No explanation, just action. This indifference is not cruel, it is clean. It is freedom in its most distilled form. What once felt like a soul entanglement now feels like a completed lesson. The empath does not look back with longing or even resentment. They simply don't look back at all. The gravitational pull has ended. They no longer feel the urge to respond, to retaliate, to justify, or to revisit. And in this stillness, there is space for something new, not a rebound, not a replacement, but a rebirth of self. The empath begins to realize that the narcissist was not just an abuser, but a catalyst. A painful one, yes, but a force that cracked the ego open and demanded transformation. And now, having answered that demand, the empath is no longer the same person. They are no longer reactive. They are no longer fragmented. They are no longer unconsciously seeking validation from the very source of their wounding. This sacred indifference is the mark of completion. It signals the end of a karmic loop, the end of an identity forged in trauma. There is no grand finale, no dramatic closure scene. There is only peace, a peace so subtle, so profound, that it goes unnoticed by the world but felt deeply within the soul of the one who has finally come home to themselves in the sixth and final stage of the empath's transformation after narcissistic abuse. Something extraordinary begins to unfold, not just healing, but the revelation of purpose reborn. This is the point where the empath, having walked through every layer of pain, illusion, fragmentation, and self-reclamation, begins to live not as a reaction to their past, but as a conscious expression of their true nature. For a long time, their identity may have revolved around survival, around managing damage, around trying to understand what happened and why. Even the early stages of healing were still tethered to the wound, still shaped by the echoes of the narcissist's presence. But here, in this final passage, the empath steps fully into a life that is no longer about escaping the past, but about embodying the future that has always been quietly waiting within them. This stage is not marked by grand gestures or public declarations, but by a quiet, steady alignment with self. The empath no longer defines themselves through the trauma or through the roles they once played. The rescuer, the healer, the overgiver, the misunderstood soul trying to fix what was never theirs to fix. Instead, they begin to ask different questions. Not what happened to me, but what wants to come through me. Not how do I keep myself safe, but what do I feel called to create, express, build, or become? These questions come from a place of deep inner clarity, from a space that is no longer rooted in fear or compensation, but in authenticity. The empath no longer needs to prove their worth through being needed. They no longer chase connection that costs their peace. Instead, they begin to protect their energy with devotion, not out of fear of being hurt again, but out of reverence for what they have become. Their boundaries are no longer reactive. They are foundational. They are not walls but doors, opening only to what resonates with truth. And through this new relationship with self, they begin to attract relationships, opportunities, and environments that reflect the healed version of who they are. Not the wounded one they once tried to hide or fix. Purpose in this stage is not about titles or roles or being seen. It is a vibration, a current that moves through the empath as they begin to act from alignment rather than obligation. They may feel drawn to share their story, not as a confession, but as a form of service, a light held up for others still lost in the dark. Or they may quietly pursue creativity, healing work, teaching, writing, art, or leadership, not because they need approval, but because these expressions arise naturally from who they are when they are no longer hiding behind survival mechanisms. They may no longer feel the same urgency to explain themselves to the world because the internal noise has quieted. There is space now for listening, for choosing, for becoming. In this stage, the empath becomes deeply attuned to joy, not as a distraction from pain, but as a compass for expansion. They begin to trust pleasure, peace, and ease as valid states, no longer feeling guilty for no longer suffering. They are not addicted to chaos, not magnetized by intensity, not trying to relive the past through new people. They are rooted in the present, creating not from trauma response but from wholeness. They no longer need closure from the narcissist because they have given themselves the only closure that ever truly matters: the decision to no longer be defined by what broke them. They have transcended the narrative of loss and stepped into the power of presence. The empath's purpose is reborn not as a task to complete, but as a way of being. They move through life with a new kind of grace, not the grace of passivity or perfection, but the grace of integration. They have met their shadow and their light, and in holding both, they radiate something unmistakable. Their presence itself becomes healing, not because they are trying to heal others, but because they have become whole. And from that wholeness, they begin to live not for the approval of others or the mending of past wounds, but for the simple, sacred act of being who they truly are, without apology, without fear, and without the need to be anything else ever again. And so, in this final stage, the empath is not simply healed, they are transformed. They are the phoenix not rising from the ashes, but knowing they were never the ashes at all. What was destroyed was illusion, what remains is essence. To walk this path is to descend into the unconscious, to face dragons of manipulation and ghosts of self-betrayal. But to emerge, that is to carry the light of self-knowledge, unshakable and serene. This is not triumph over the narcissist. It is transcendence of the need to triumph at all. In the end, the empath does not return to who they were. They become who they truly are. Thank you.